Across the Pacific Northwest coast, storms were part of life's rhythm. The Coast Salish saw the ocean turn silver before the wind screamed through the valleys, bending the tall cedar forests until the trees bowed like dancers. Far across the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe watched black clouds build along the horizon and ripple the endless water before thunder broke over their villages. To these peoples, the storm was not an enemy to be feared. It was a teacher. It showed them which trees could bend without breaking, which slops drained the rain, and how air itself carried life when harnessed, not resisted. Centuries before modern meteorology, they mapped the moods of wind and water through observation and story. Their elders told children to feel the ground tremble before lightning struck, to note how smoke drifted when pressure changed. Every lesson was recorded in memory and song. Shelter, they believed, must not stand against nature. It must breathe with it, sharing its pulse and patience. From this understanding grew the art of weatherwise architecture. Along the coastal inlets, the Salish and Haida crafted tipis and plank structures from cedar poles so supple they could sway under gales. Bark sheets overlapped like fish scales, shedding water yet allowing air to pass through hidden seams. Each join was lashed with spruce roots that expanded when wet, tightening instead of tearing apart. In the Great Lakes region, the Ojibwe applied the same natural wisdom using birch, willow, and reeds. Their domed lodges curved low to the ground, catching less wind, their outer skins sealed with birch resin that turned rain into gliding silver threads. Both regions shared a principle modern engineers might call flexible geometry. No sharp corners, no rigid walls for the wind to seize. Every curve guided the gust back toward the earth. These shelters could groan, breathe, and release tension like living organisms. Over time, their designs became both functional and sacred, a physical prayer for balance between human hands and elemental power. When storms arrived, families gathered inside their shelters, listening to thunder roll across the land like a drum announcing renewal. Rain hammered the cedar and birch, but inside there was calm, the scent of smoke, the glow of embers, the slow rise and fall of the roof above them. Children watched how poles flexed and mats shivered under gusts, learning that motion meant endurance, not fragility. After each tempest, elders inspected the bindings, repaired what nature attested, and retold the stories of the first builders who shaped wisdom into wood. These tipis and lodges were more than protection. They were memory structures, living blueprints of coexistence. To survive meant to cooperate with the elements, never to conquer them. When the sky cleared and sunlight poured through the vents once more, the people stepped out to meet the steaming earth, reminded that true strength lies not in defiance, but in understanding. Before they ever shaped a single pole or stretched a bark panel, the people learned from the land itself. Along the Pacific inlets, the Coast Salish watched cedar trees endure centuries of storms, their roots gripping rock while their trunks swayed with the wind. In the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe studied birch, noting how its bark shed water and healed from small wounds. Nature offered blueprints in plain sight: flexibility, layering, renewal. The Haida, who carved canoes and house beams from massive cedars, understood that strength without movement meant fracture. They taught their children to read the forest as others read words, each sound, each scent, each shift of the air a clue to the way structures must live with the weather. The forest became both teacher and textbook, revealing how shelter must imitate the patience of trees and the measured breath of the earth. Observation was a communal ritual. When wind pushed through a valley, elders traced the path of moving branches, explaining why some trees twisted instead of snapping. Hunters returning from distant islands described how seabirds built low nests from grass and driftwood, never losing them to gusts. Women gathering bark noted how moisture crept along the fibers, teaching them how to weave coverings that breathed but did not rot. Every act of survival carried instruction. Around nightly fires, stories retold these discoveries, of a woman who learned to seal her roof by watching beavers plaster their dams, or of a boy who found that curved poles resisted the wind more than straight ones. In this oral classroom, failure was not shame, but memory. Each broken shelter, each collapsed wall, was remembered and corrected by the next generation, until nothing about their craft belonged to chance. Through centuries of watching and rebuilding, the people came to see no boundary between life and design. Their shelters were not separate from the world, they were continuations of it. The cedar and birch that formed their walls once stood in the forest. catching the same wind they would later endure as dwellings. The soil beneath remained untouched, so rain could drain as it always had. Even smoke from their fires rose in harmony with natural airflow, carried away without choking the heart of the home. In the eyes of the Salish, Haida and Ojibwe, to build without understanding nature was to invite collapse, not just of a structure but of balance itself, and so they built by listening. The whisper of wind through leaves, the creak of trunks, the rhythm of rain on bark, all became lessons in endurance. Nature was not an obstacle, it was the first and most patient teacher. Building began long before the first pole was lifted. It started in the forest, where each person knew which materials belonged to which purpose. The Coast Salish searched for cedar trees that grew straight and tall, yet soft enough to carve. They never took a trunk without ceremony, leaving an offering of shell or berry to acknowledge its spirit. Far north, the Haida selected red cedar for strength and yellow cedar for flexibility, balancing them like breath and bone within their shelters. Across the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe gathered birch bark after the spring thaw, cutting only from living trees in careful strips so the tree could heal. They collected sap for waterproofing, roots for binding, and reeds for lining. Each community moved quietly through the woods, carrying stone adzes, antler wedges, and woven baskets. Every act of gathering was an exchange, taking only what the land could spare, shaping homes from patience, not haste. Once the materials were gathered, the work became communal rhythm. Piles of poles dried in the sun while families prepared bark and fibres along riverbanks. Children carried bundles of reeds, elders sorted fibres by texture, and the air filled with the scent of fresh wood. The Haida treated cedar with heated stones to curve poles without splitting, a technique passed through memory rather than measure. The Coast Salish smoothed bark into long sheets, pressing them beneath stones so they would lie flat when layered. The Ojibwe soaked birch in warm water to soften it, making it pliable for overlapping seams. There were no written plans, only gestures and repetition. Each task had its own sound, the rasp of scraping, the creak of bending wood, the soft rhythm of weaving. The process was slow, deliberate and meditative, as though time itself moved to the pace of the forest's breath. By midday, the gathered pieces began to resemble intention. Cedar poles stood ready like sentinels, birch bark gleamed in rolls, and the scent of sap mixed with lake wind. The builders paused often, not from fatigue but reflection. They checked the grain of each pole, the flexibility of each lash, the way sunlight passed through thin layers of bark. Everything had meaning. A misaligned pole could twist a roof. Too much resin could trap smoke. Even the ground mattered. Its slope, its drainage, the direction it faced to meet or avoid the wind. The structure was imagined within the landscape, never apart from it. When they finally lifted the first frame, the act felt less like construction and more like cooperation. The people and the land were partners in endurance, each trusting the other to hold fast when the storm returned. When the first poles were lifted, the skeleton of the dwelling took form like a growing tree. The builders began with the tripod, 3 long cedar poles bound together at the top, raised toward the sky, and spread wide at the base. This shape, simple yet sacred, gave balance and strength to everything that followed. The Coast Salish treated the alignment of poles as a ceremony, singing low rhythmic chants so that the structure's first breath would be peaceful. The Haida, masters of coastal geometry, often shaped their frames slightly off-centre to guide wind pressure around the shelter instead of against it. Across the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe preferred a rounded lattice, forming graceful arches that echoed the curvature of canoes. Each curve, knot and joint spoke the same silent language. Movement, not rigidity, kept the structure alive. The forest's design had become their architecture, and every hand that lifted a pole carried memory older than words. Once the core was standing, layers of poles radiated outward, tied with roots that expanded in moisture and tightened as they dried. The sound of fibre stretching echoed like music through the trees. The people readjusted angles by eye, not by tool, trusting inherited instinct. Cedar bark was softened and laid across the frame in overlapping layers, each one slanted to send rain downward. Haida builders tested the slope by sprinkling water from their palms, watching it roll cleanly away. On the shores of the Great Lakes, Ojibwe builders bound reed mats and birch panels with plaited vines, creating smooth, wind-resistant surfaces. There were no nails or metal fittings, only natural tension and pressure, mastered through repetition. The final form rose as an organic shape, Closer to sculpture than construction, its weight distributed evenly so that the wind could not claim any single side. Every joint was both practical and poetic. When finished, the frame seemed alive, breathing with the forest's rhythm. From a distance, the conical and domed shapes blended into the landscape, neither dominating nor hiding from it. Builders would circle their work, listening for the creaks that told them where to reinforce or release tension. A well-made frame did not resist the wind. It welcomed it, allowing gusts to pass through as water flows around stone. Children were taught to run their hands along the poles and feel their give. This was strength, not weakness. The shelter's frame was more than engineering. It was a lesson about coexistence. It reminded the people that survival came not from mastering nature, but from aligning with it. In every curved pole and tied root, they had recreated the world's balance in miniature, an architecture of motion, humility, and endurance that could outlast any storm. When the frame stood firm, the true test began: how to make it live through the storm. Rain on the Pacific coast could last for weeks, each drop heavy with salt and wind. The Coast Salish learned to armour their shelters with layers of cedar bark peeled into wide sheets, dried by fire smoke and pressed flat with smooth stones. These were laid like scales on a fish, overlapping from the ground upward so that every droplet slid harmlessly away. The Haida sealed the outer layers with thin mats of shredded cedar fibre, which swelled slightly when wet and closed the cracks between sheets. Across the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe covered their dome lodges with birch bark, its waxy skin naturally shedding rain. Resin from pine and birch was boiled into waterproof glue, brushed onto seams using bundles of moss. Every material was drawn from the same environment that threatened them, each storm teaching its own remedy. Drying and sealing were community rituals. Women prepared the bark by heating it over embers until it curled into pliant ribbons. Men gathered resin from fallen trees and mixed it with powdered charcoal for durability. Children fetched river stones to hold mats in place as they cooled. Around them, the air filled with the fragrance of cedar smoke and sap. The process had rhythm: soft scraping, the hiss of bark touching heat, the steady murmur of shared work. The Haida used heated stones wrapped in kelp to flatten bark edges, creating smooth surfaces that resisted tearing. The Coast Salish pressed fibre mats beneath weighted logs so they would dry evenly. Along the lake shores, Ojibwe elders tested birch sheets by pouring water from their palms, adjusting seams until no droplets seeped through. The entire community became part of the shelter's weatherproofing, transforming labour into song and science in equal measure. By midday, each structure shone under sunlight like living bark. The outer layers breathed softly in the wind, flexing instead of breaking, and the resin seams gleamed faintly with captured light. Inside, the air stayed dry and cool. Even during downpours, smoke from the central fire rose through the vent without dampening the hearth below. Travellers could step in soaked to the bone and find warmth waiting, proof that patience was a kind of engineering. These weatherproofing methods endured for centuries without a written word, preserved by repetition, observation, and respect. The shelters were not only barriers against nature, they were extensions of it. When the rain passed, the bark glistened like fresh skin, and the people knew their homes had survived another trial. In every droplet that slid down their walls, the wisdom of countless storms shimmered quietly back into the earth. Inside the completed shelter, the final challenge was unseen: how to control the invisible movements of heat and air. Fire was life, but it could also suffocate if trapped. Generations of Coast Salish builders studied how smoke drifted through gaps in cedar bark, adjusting openings until it escaped cleanly. The Haida learned to carve small vents just below the roof peak, allowing warm air to rise while fresh air entered from low door flaps. The Ojibwe mastered a similar balance, shaping smoke holes that faced away from prevailing winds. When the central fire burned, the air above shimmered, the smoke turning into thin grey threads that climbed upward and vanished. This was early environmental engineering, precise, tested by centuries of trial and wind. To an outsider, it was instinct. To them, it was science written in air, perfected through patience. The placement of fire within the shelter was just as important as its venting. The Haida positioned the hearth slightly off-centre, so that rising smoke travelled diagonally, guided toward the vent rather than trapped above the sleepers. The Coast Salish created low stone circles that held embers longer, conserving heat even after the flames dimmed. Across the Great Lakes, Ojibwe families used bark troughs, filled with glowing coals to distribute warmth around the interior. Animal hides hung behind the fire reflected radiant heat, turning the inner space into a living equilibrium of warmth and breath. No written plans guided this, only observation. Children were taught to watch the fire's movement, to note when it coughed smoke back into the room, to read the invisible draughts that curled through the walls. A well-made dwelling needed no chimney. It breathed like the forest itself. Even in heavy rain or deep cold, the air inside remained comfortable. Smoke rose slowly through the vent, mixing with beams of light that cut down from above. The filtered sunlight flickered against the bark walls like water ripples, and the rhythm of the flame matched the wind outside. People spoke softly here. The sound of crackling wood and gentle draughts filled the silence. The architecture was both practical and spiritual, linking body and breath to the cycles of the natural world. Warmth flowed, air turned, and the structure stayed alive. The people who built these homes did not invent comfort by escaping nature. They found it by living within her logic. The balance of heat, smoke, and air became more than survival. It was harmony in motion, the unseen proof that intelligence could rise quietly with the smoke and drift into the sky. When the final pole was tied and the smoke vent shaped, the building was no longer wood and bark, it was spirit. Among the Coast Salish and Haida, construction was never a private act but a ceremony of connection. Families gathered to sing as the last bindings were secured, their voices rising through the forest air like wind through cedar leaves. The Haida believed the rhythm of song strengthened the frame itself. That vibration settled the poles into harmony. The Ojibwe carried a similar belief. A dwelling built without blessing could not keep out the cold. Before stepping inside for the first time, they burned sweetgrass or cedar tips, letting the smoke swirl through the entrance to awaken the new home. Children were told to enter quietly, touching the doorframe in respect. In that moment the structure gained identity, not just as shelter, but as a living relative that would breathe, protect, and remember. Within these shelters, life was shared from sunrise to dusk. The smell of cedar and birch mixed with cooking fires, and voices blended with the rustle of wind outside. Women prepared food near the hearth, men shaped new tools or repaired bindings, and children played by tracing patterns in the dust. The architecture itself invited gathering. The circular interiors encouraged conversation, reflection, and equality. Everyone could see the fire and each other's faces. Stories of ancestors and creation were told as sunlight passed slowly across the walls. The Haida decorated interior poles with carved lines and red pigments, marks of lineage and protection. The Coast Salish hung woven mats and shell ornaments that shimmered when the wind moved. Across the lakes, the Ojibwe adorned their lodge walls with painted symbols of thunderbirds and lakes, reminders of balance and renewal. The home was both school and sanctuary, where history lived not in books, but in air and memory. As days passed, the shelter became a map of its people's rhythm. Every creak in the poles, every mark on the bark recorded their presence. When storms came, families gathered close, sharing warmth and food until the air cleared again. The structure's breathing mirrored their own, the expansion with heat, the settling with cold. It was more than protection. It was a circle of trust. Elders would tell the young that each dwelling carried the voice of those who built it, and to treat it as one treats a friend. When travellers visited, they were greeted with the same firelight that burned at the shelter's birth, a quiet continuity between generations. In this harmony of wood, smoke, and song, the people remembered who they were. The shelter was not an object, but a reflection of the community's soul, proof that endurance and belonging were built by many hands moving as one. The moment of truth always came with the wind. When the skies darkened over the Pacific or the Great Lakes grew restless, the people watched the horizon like readers of an ancient language. Clouds did not merely threaten, they warned. The Coast Salish knew the smell of rain before it fell, the way cedar needles turned their silver side to the air. The Haida, living along storm-carved coasts, studied how seabirds vanished inland moments before the first strike of lightning. Across the lakes, the Ojibwe felt the rhythm of thunder echo through the water, long before the rain touched their lodges. In those moments, families moved together, tightening lashings, lowering coverings, securing mats. Nothing was left to chance. The shelters they had built were no longer silent objects. They were participants in the coming test. And as the wind began to hum through the forest, the people listened, not in fear, but in readiness. The first impact of the storm struck with sudden force. Rain hammered against bark and reeds, bending poles and flattening grass. Yet the shelters stood firm. The cedar layers of the Coast Salish homes swelled slightly, sealing themselves against leaks. The Haida's curved poles bent gracefully, channeling wind upward instead of inward. The Ojibwe lodges, low and rounded, let the rain slide off in clean streams. Inside, families tended their fires, feeding them slowly to keep warmth alive. The smoke vents breathed steadily, drawing air upward even as gusts raged above. Children listened to the sounds of the storm, the hiss of rain, the deep heartbeat of wind against bark. What might have seemed fragility to outsiders was, in truth, resilience. The materials moved with the storm, absorbing its force and returning it harmlessly to the air. Nature tested, and the people answered, not with resistance but with understanding. When daylight finally broke through the clouds, the world glistened. The shelters shone with droplets that rolled like beads along their sides. Fires still smouldered, their smoke turning golden in the new sun. Families stepped outside quietly, breathing the scent of wet cedar and earth. Elders examined the bindings, pressing each root tie and checking for loosened seams. Most held perfectly. A few were retied and strengthened. No panic, no surprise, just calm adjustment. The continuation of a cycle as old as memory. Children splashed in puddles while parents dried mats in the sun. Across the Pacific coast and the Great Lakes, it was the same scene. Structures that had bent and breathed through the storm now stood unbroken. The people saw not triumph, but confirmation. That wisdom, patience, and cooperation could outlast any force. Each surviving shelter was a quiet declaration that human knowledge, when joined with nature, could never truly fall. Long after the storm passed, the lessons of those shelters continued to shape the people's way of life. Each generation inherited more than structure, they inherited understanding. The Coast Salish passed down the art of cedar work as a rite of balance, teaching that wood had memory and must be shaped with respect. The Haida turned the same design principles into monumental house poles and canoes, using the same geometry that once held their shelters firm. Across the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe carried the birch bark craft into every aspect of their world. Canoes, containers, coverings, all following the same logic of layering and breadth. What began as necessity became identity. Children learned early that a home built with wisdom stood not only against storms, but against time itself. Through repetition and care, the architecture became a story, one told not in words, but in the enduring silence of cedar, bark, and stone. Even centuries later, echoes of that design remain. In the Pacific Northwest, modern indigenous architects still trace their lineage to those early engineers, blending ancestral geometry with contemporary form. Ventilation systems in longhouses and energy-efficient lodges follow the same airflow principles, discovered by observation rather than calculation. Across the Great Lakes, the gentle curves of birch-inspired structures still inform native builders' reviving ancestral techniques. Yet, beyond technology, what truly survived was philosophy, the understanding that harmony with the elements ensures survival longer than any tool of conquest. The old builders proved that balance, not domination, yields endurance. Where other civilizations sought to tame nature, these communities listened. That wisdom, shaped by cedar, tested by wind, and remembered in song, continues to whisper through every bark wall and polished pole that stands today. As the camera of time moves forward, we can still see their legacy breathing in the modern landscape. Cedar lodges rising near the coast, birch domes standing quietly among maple groves, and community fires glowing beneath open vents. These are not relics. They are living philosophies disguised as wood and fibre. The same winds that once tested their ancestors now pass through, unchanged, carrying stories older than memory. The Coast Salish, Haida, and Ojibwe did not leave monuments of stone. They left blueprints of coexistence. Their homes remind us that endurance does not come from resisting the world, but from moving with it. Every pole that still stands is an echo of that truth, every wall a continuation of that dialogue. Their architecture endures as a conversation between humanity and the living earth, a design that never ends because it was never meant to.